Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to all my very dear students. This is your English instructor Miss Kainat Kamal and I welcome you all to the lecture 9 of Intermediate English class 2nd year. So dear students, before going into today's lecture, I would like to make you people recall the previous lecture that we are done with Unit 1 and all the 3 lessons that Unit 1 contains. So today we are going to start our Unit 2 and that is about hope and aspiration. This unit contains 3 readings. The very first one is I Have a Dream. It is a speech by Martin Luther King Jr. The second lesson of Unit 2 is Glory and Hope by Nelson Mandela. Again, it is a speech. And the third lesson of Unit 2 is a poem, I Dream a World. And this poem is written by an American black poet, Langston Hughes. Okay, dear students, the thing that is common among these 3 chapters, these 3 lessons, I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr., Glory and Hope speech by Nelson Mandela, and I Dream a World is a poem by Langston Hughes. So these 3 lessons, these 2 speeches and 1 poem that has been delivered by American blacks. So the common thing about these 3 lessons are that all the 3 authors of these units, of these lessons, I would say, they are blacks. So today we are going to start the very first lesson of Unit 2, that is I Dream a World speech by Martin Luther King Jr. So getting into pre-reading, have you heard the name Martin Luther King Jr.? He fought for the rights of the black people in the United States of America in the 1950s. This was a momentous speech that paved the way for Negroes to have their rights. What kind of dream Dr. King Jr. is talking about? Do some research to find the conditions in which the black people lived that prompted this speech. So, as we are not going into the readings of the chapter today, so this question I'm putting in front of you, that what kind of dream do you think Dr. King Jr. is talking about? So, before going into the details of the chapter, before going into the readings of the chapter, you should just make a guess that what this speech would be about and what Dr. King Jr., Martin Luther King, he wanted to say, what he talked about. Fine. So you have to do some research to find the conditions in which the black people lived that prompted this speech. So what you're supposed to do is just take out a pen and a page and write down few points with you that come in your mind about the very speech, that what it would be about. And please do share that page, the photo of that page with me on our WhatsApp group. Okay, so moving towards our next slide. So before starting the reading of the chapter, we should know what this phrase I have a dream is all about. So I have a dream is a public speech that was delivered by American civil rights activist whose name was Martin Luther King Jr. And he delivered this speech on August 28, 1963, and the place where he delivered this speech was Lincoln Memorial. And over 250,000 civil rights supporters, they were there, who were listening directly to the American civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. And this speech is a defining moment of the American civil rights movement. Okay, now the purpose of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream, is to basically expose the American public the injustice of racial inequality and to persuade them to stop discriminating on the basis of race, color, and caste. So, the purpose was to inculcate in their mind that they should stop discriminating on the basis of color, the black and the white. Okay, so we should know about, we should have some knowledge about the writer of the very speech, and that is Martin Luther King Jr. So, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1926 in Atlanta, Georgia. King, both a Baptist minister and civil rights activist, had a seismic impact on race relations in the United States, beginning in the mid 1950s. Through his activism, he played a pivotal role in ending the legal segregation of African American citizens in the South and other areas of the US, as well as the creation of the Civil Rights Act 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, among several other honors. King was assassinated in April 1968 and continues to be remembered as one of the most lauded African American leaders in the history. Often referenced by his 1963 speech, I Have a Dream, that we would study in the coming future, inshallah. So, he was one of the greatest orators in American history because he was famous for his oratory. And on October 14th, 1964, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality through non-violence. So this was basically a brief introduction about the writer Martin Luther King. Now moving toward the historical background of the speech. So before going into the readings of the chapter, before going into the analysis of the chapter, we should know some of the brief historical background of the very speech by Martin Luther King Jr. So, I Have a Dream is a public speech that was delivered by American civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So, this was basically the purpose, the reason they were doing that very march on Washington DC. So the very march was for jobs and for freedom, and it was on August 28, 1963, in which he called for civil and economic rights and an end to racism in United States. Delivered to over 250,000 civil rights supporters from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The speech was a defining moment of the civil rights movement and among the most iconic speeches in American history. So, this speech by Martin Luther King is basically known as is basically among the most iconic speeches in American history. So the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was partially intended to demonstrate mass support for the civil rights legislation proposed by President Kennedy in June. Martin Luther King and other leaders therefore agreed to keep their speeches calm, also to avoid provoking the civil disobedience which had become the hallmark of the civil rights movement. King originally designed his speech as a homage to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, timed to correspond with the 100-year centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. When we would start our chapter, the reading of the chapter, inshallah, so the very first line in which he refers to Abraham Lincoln, 50 years ago, a great American. So when he says a great American, he is here basically referring to Abraham Lincoln. So that is the reason it has been written over here that King originally designed his speech as a homage to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So at the very start of his speech, he addresses to the great American whose name was Abraham Lincoln. And Emancipation Proclamation, these things we would inshallah discuss during the reading of the chapter. Okay, there are some of the, here we go with the more details about the speech. So King's speech invokes the Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? From the slavery, from inequality, from injustice. The Emancipation Proclamation and the United States Constitution. So these three things, are basically the purposes of Martin Luther King's speech. Early in his speech, King alludes to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address by saying, 50 years ago, in reference to the abolition of slavery articulated in the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation, basically it was giving you a brief glimpse of the very word. It was basically an act of settling from the slavery. Okay, here basically Martin Luther King Jr., he uses some of the references from his speech. So when he says that it came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. This is basically a line from the original speech, original text. Early in his speech, King urges his audience to seize the moment. Now is the time, is repeated 3 times in the 6th paragraph. The most widely cited example of anaphora is found in the often quoted phrase. Anaphora is basically a figure of speech, and anaphora, if we defined anaphora, so anaphora is a repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of 2 or more sentences. So if you could see in this very speech, some of the phrases that repeatedly the Martin Luther King he has used. For example, he has quoted "I have a dream," which is repeated 8 times as King paints a picture of an integrated and united America for his audience. Other occasions include 100 years later, "We can never be satisfied with this faith, let freedom ring," and "free at last." So these are some of the phrases that he repeatedly used in his speech. And inshallah, in our next lecture, we would critically analyze the speech, and I would make your mind clear for all the things that have been discussed in this brief detail about the speech. This is basically a general overview, or you can say an introduction to the speech of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so now what is the main message of the speech? So the ideas in the speech reflect King's social experience of ethnocentric abuse, the mistreatment and exploitation of blacks. So you all are highly familiar with the treatment of whites, that how they treated black in America and in South Africa. So basically this speech, the words, the phrases of Martin Luther King reflect the social experience, because he himself was a black. So all his experience being a black American, that the ethnocentric abuse, that being from that very race, from the black race, so the treatment that he has faced from the whites, the mistreatment and the exploitation, inequality, injustice. So all these things we can conclude and we can see they are basically reflected in the speech of Martin Luther King. The speech draws upon appeals to America's myths as a nation founded to provide freedom and justice to all the people. Now he has named this very a logo, or you can say the motto or the Constitution of America, that all the people, they would be treated equally. On freedom, they would be provided the freedom, they would be provided with the justice. So he has considered this very equality, freedom, justice a myth. It has become a myth for them because they were not treated equally. They were the victims of injustice, inequality, exploitation, mistreatment, and then reinforces and transcends those secular mythologies by placing them within a spiritual context, by arguing that racial justice is also in accord with God's will, to give African Americans the freedom and equality they deserve. So these are some of the basically the main messages that we could see. They are highly and clearly reflected by the speech of Martin Luther King. Okay, now moving towards the compositional strategies and techniques. So this speech has been divided into two halves. So the very first half portrays not an idealized American dream, but a picture of a seething American nightmare of racial injustice. So the American dream of equality, freedom, justice, no violation over there. So it was not that idealized society portrayed by Martin Luther King. Rather, it was a picture of a seething American nightmare of racial injustice, because the blacks were mistreated, they were violated, they were considered as the, you can say, the inferior creature. So they were the victims of inequality, injustice. So the second half of the speech paints the dream of a better, fairer future of racial harmony and integration. In the previous slides, if you could recall, I have told you people about that Martin Luther King, he was calm in his speech. He did not directly threatened somebody. Rather, he was like, he has divided, very logically divided his speech into two halves. So the very first half, he portrayed a nightmare of racial injustice in America, and in the second half, he painted the dream of a better, fairer future of the racial harmony and integration. The most famous paragraph carries the theme, I have a dream, and the phrase is repeated constantly to hammer home King's inspirational concepts. So his concepts was the injustice-free society. Everybody should have freedom. There should be no, you can say, there should be no inequality, no injustice. So the society should be justice, inequality, violation, mistreatment free. Okay, so now moving towards the next slide, and that is, what are the three factors impact of the, like, these are the following, these three factors which you could see on your screens are basically the factors that impact, that had some impact on the very speech. So the very first factor is the remarkable emotion of King's delivery in terms of both voice and body. So this speech is famous for his figurative language. Fine. So, inshallah, in the next lecture, when we would go into the details of the chapter, the readings of the chapter, you would come to know that in this speech, Martin Luther King Jr., he has used a very highly figurative language. The use of language is not an ordinary one. He has used metaphors, anaphras. So, this speech and the delivery, both in terms of voice and body, the content and the methodology. So both in terms of voice, body and content, this speech is remarkable in its emotions. that what he has suffered, and all the nation, the blacks, they were suffering from the hands of whites. The site at which it was delivered, on the steps of the memorial to the president who defeated southern states over the issue of slavery. So the place where he was delivering this very speech, it was Lincoln Memorial. So itself, the place was it was a memorial in his like it was something in the history, if you could see. It was famous for, it was a motivational, it was a site where he delivered his speech. It was worth delivering. Why? Because it was a memorial to the president who defeated southern states over the issue of slavery over there. So for the same cause, Martin Luther King, at the same place, he was delivering his speech. Okay, moving towards the next point, the mood of the day. A sense of perpetuated slavery among black people and the gradual realization of a sense of guilt among the white people. So now the same thing, like the two sides of a same coin. The perpetuated slavery among black people, like that sense of being a slave, that sense of being the victim of injustice, being the victim of inequality, mistreatment, violation, and on the other hand, the gradual realization in the minds, in the heart of the white people, and that sense of guilt that they were feeling right there at that moment. The guilt was the mistreatment with the blacks, the violation of their rights and their privileges, that inequality that they show toward them. So these are basically some of the main points, or you can say some of the main features of the speech you should or you all should know in your mind before going into the critical analysis, before going into the reading of the very speech. So these things are basically the foundation for going into the details, and you all should know. And at the end, I would once again repeat the purpose of his speech, Martin Luther King's speech, that this speech was basically to expose the American public. To expose in what sense? In the sense of inequality, injustice, violation, mistreatment with the blacks. They were not giving their proper rights, proper privileges. They were not giving their freedom, the required, the needed freedom. They were not given equality, not justice even. So he wanted to expose the American public, the whites, the injustice of racial inequality on the basis of color, on the basis of caste, on the basis of creed, on the basis of race. So that racism he basically wanted to expose, and to persuade them. Persuade whom? To the white. To stop this discrimination. The discrimination of injustice, inequality, violation, mistreatment. So he basically wanted to provoke them to stop discriminating on the basis of race. So my dear students, that was all about the background of the memorial speech of Martin Luther King Jr. Inshallah, in our next lecture, we would look into some of the main important vocabulary items from the text. For example, the Emancipation Proclamation, what is this? The promissory note that he has talked about. Then he talked about like anaphora that he has used, and rest of the figurative use of language that he has used in his speech. So this speech is basically, it needs concentration to understand. So I hope that you all would be with fresh minds, inshallah, in the next lecture would be there. And let me repeat for you people. So this question you should answer before going into the explanation of the chapter, that what kind of dream do you think Dr. King Jr. is talking about? and I have given you the background of the very speech. Now your mind would be able to write down even 5 to 6 points. So definitely I would be needing your points in our WhatsApp group. So it's all for today. Inshallah, see you in our next lecture. Thank you, my dear students. Stay blessed all. Thank you.